Our final contributor tonight is Alastair Blyth, and Alastair is an analyst with the OECD Centre for Learning Environments, CELE. He's an architect and a senior lecturer and senior research fellow at the University of Westminster in London. He co-authored a book, Managing the Brief for Better Design, which was first published in 2001, and he has written on a range of technical subjects for the UK Architectural, Property and Construction Press. But before Alastair talks to us about his review, which opens the compendium, which is a review of looking back over 50 years of educational buildings that was referred to by Christiane, we will see a video from North America this time, and the first one from the tertiary sector. It's the School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa by Stephen Hall.
The building itself provides students with wonderful spaces in which to create art. It also has generated tremendous excitement and energy for the campus as a whole because of its great beauty and aesthetic value.
Right from this moment, when you first enter the building, the idea is that you would feel that you didn't enter a building, you entered space that keeps going. So this notion of openness or porosity is kind of the first experience of the building. Because the school's not in like an object building, it has an openness, it looks back on itself. So this feeling of the space being, let's say, more elastic than in a normal rectilinear building. So you feel a community, which is really important for education.
The prominent placement of the gallery and the fact that it was the main space that welcomed you as you entered, for me, it definitely set the stage for feeling like I was walking into a space that not only respected, but celebrated the production of art.
There was these wonderful floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out onto the bluff and to the pond below, and it was really great to sit there and read and take notes and write. It was a really, really pleasant space to get a lot of inspired work done.
One of the things that I definitely noticed about the entire building was how much light played a part of the architecture. I remember having to take classes that night. I would walk up to the building and the lights would be on, and sort of seemed like the space would take the light throughout the day and then emit it at night, and sort of glowing off of the pond and everything along those lines.
Something to celebrate in that building is that you didn't feel like the disciplines were segregated. You definitely felt like a cohesive group in a way that was ultimately just really inspiring.
Students, of course, are always very concerned about where they are going to be learning about art, and so now they can learn about art and study it within a work of art itself. The building is a beautiful work of art.
Alastair, please, the floor is yours. If you want to.
Okay. Well, actually, one of the interesting things about that school of art is it's in a public university, and that building itself is a gateway to the campus. So it's not a rich university in the sort of Harvard Yale sense. But what I wanted to draw from that was that one of the things, looking back over the last 50 years of the Programme on Educational Buildings as we were, and then the Centre for Effective Learning Environments more recently, is that this idea of making a school as being making a place for learning, a place for social interaction that Christian talked about, and a place for communities. And it's been very interesting tracking how we see a shift in emphasis from back in the 60s and 70s, when school building programs were enormous programs of new schools to cater for large numbers of students that were being through all ages. And the shift from there gradually through to, well, we've got all these buildings now in the 70s and 80s. What do we do with them? We have to manage them. And notions of flexibility, which, as Christian mentioned, was perhaps more of a technical concern in terms of moving partitions, through to today when you see flexibility in much more of a spatial, moving furniture around in spaces and so on. But the big question is, I think, how, and it remains so today, is how to manage these places, these buildings, effectively. And it's a question that educators face, as school principals face, like Martin has a lovely set of buildings, but they have to be managed. The money has to be found to do it. They have to be maintained. And so all the buildings that were being built in the 60s and 70s have recently been the subject of, in some countries, big renovation programs, which perhaps at the moment have been curtailed because of the economic crisis, the economic financial downturn. But nevertheless, it points to one of the continuing areas of concern, I think, and that's reflected again over the last 50 years, that unglamorous as it may be, this question of maintenance is still very much on the agenda. And in the 1980s, again, it was picked up at a number of conferences that we ran, and these action plans were created. Yet maybe that maintenance problem was never wholly solved, because still it's a significant issue. And so we see, as we move then through the 80s and 90s, to a greater focus perhaps on the role of, really the role of the user and the client in the process of creating these places. And one of the things that I would draw from the comments we've heard already this afternoon is it's about collaboration. It's about how you get the engagement of everybody, not just the architect with the one person who is from the client, whether it's the school or the educational authority. It's about all of those who are concerned. And indeed, in the later 70s, there was a lot of work done on the use of schools as community facilities. Again, we're revisiting that now as we begin to pick up on that theme that schools themselves and universities are more than just places for learning. They are actually often, and as the example in Chile shows, they are actually centers of a community, a real community hub, and that's again has wider policy implications in terms of what our governments and our authorities should be thinking about in terms of creating these places. They're not just creating buildings per se, it's about the people who use them, and that's the real issue, I think. And so we see, as we move forward, and we moved forward into sort of millennium, the notion that architecture and school design can be a focus for education transformation. And that really is transformation of education, again, of learning and teaching. And it's much, much wider than just the buildings. And again, we've heard this afternoon about how focusing perhaps on a project like an architectural project is one way of beginning to question how education occurs and happens, and learning and teaching occurs and happens within a school or a set of schools or in an education system. And so the process maybe of creating educational buildings, whether it's preschool buildings, whether it's secondary schools, primary schools, and whether it's higher education and universities, is as much a process about understanding of the activities and how those people use those buildings, which is really what the buildings are there to support. They're there to support the user, and that again comes across all the way through the work that we've seen over the last 50 years, 40 years that the program has done, but 50 years really of the OECD. And I would kind of focus on that issue, that the emphasis has shifted, yet often the themes have remained the same. As I say, flexibility, communities, technology have all been there over the last 50 years and played a role in the development of providing places for education. But there's been a subtle shift over that period of time, which I think is important to recognize. So with that, I would just kind of conclude by saying that as we perhaps look forward from where we are now, and Christian's picked up on this, we see a development, and it becomes clear in the compendium that you're seeing greater number of a variety of spaces within buildings and the way they're used, and the way education is able to take advantage of them. And it really unlocks education possibilities. And that's perhaps another key role of the architecture, the backdrop, if you like. It's about unlocking the potential. And whilst there are still very many traditionally conceived environments of school buildings, of classrooms, boxes lined up side by side, rather like train carriages against a corridor, there is beginning to be greater fluidity, more connection between these parts of these buildings. And again, it's about social interaction. We see a lot of that coming through. So I'm optimistic about providing new ways, new places in which education can take place. I'm optimistic in the sense that we might have an economic crisis now, but actually I think as everybody, educators, those who develop the policy from the local and national governments, and indeed the designers, and all get together, they can create new and better and different environments. And there may, in the end, in the future, not be what we would recognize as a traditional school, or indeed a traditional university as a place. But it is still a place for the community.
Thank you, Alastair.